Uh, yeah, okay. So what I wanted to present today is I think it serves three purposes at once. One is that I think it's an opportunity to try to further develop something that Rafael Moscardi started developing in the Atlas in his section on what's called Seeing Nature. So it's the only text we have that discusses, even if I mean directly discusses issues of how is nature integrated into capitalism, and how do we account for issues that concern ecology and so on. But it's also, let's say, through that, I think the only time any of us discussed on paper as STP members anything that has a direct bearing on climate politics and things like this, which is not only a crucial topic today, but it's also a place where a lot of specific debates are happening. So it's an interesting place to find out if we have something different to say. Then it's also an opportunity to start building on something which is why I plan until early next year. So slowly do 3 presentations. If today I don't manage to cover everything, it's not a problem. Then I would have like a 1.5 here, just finishing this one. But my idea is to divide the work into 3 parts that they're slightly different, but they build on each other. So the first is this, which is directly connected to what Moscardi did, which is discussing, okay, how does nature appear in the schema we've been constructing and some of the ideas that already appeared. The second is a kind of turn towards a different topic that I immediately wouldn't connect with this, which is an idea to bring together 2 insights. One is an insight from Soren Mao's recent book on value form, which is that capitalist compulsion acts through the environment. So what does environment mean? What is a social environment? What does it mean for us to be constrained because the environment is put up in such a way that costs for actions are such and such, right? So on one hand, that does connect to the issue of what I'm calling environmental logic, adds a different layer to it. So it's not environment in the sense of ecology, but environment in the social sense. But it also connects with a topic that allows us to continue something that I presented I think early this year or late last year, I don't remember, which was on surrogate reasoning, because the idea of an environment is also a crucial category in what's called distributed cognition. So the idea that you build capacity for reason and to reason differently by creating indexes, or what they call anchors in the environment that facilitate that reasoning to take that direction. So it lowers the cost of certain assumptions versus the cost of other assumptions. So if Soren talks about, let's say, the capitalist environment, that idea of an environment as something that helps you to reason in a direction rather than another, to take certain actions rather than another, can also be politicized on the other direction. So what does it mean to have like a political environment that makes some assumptions that are hard to maintain today easier in a different context? And then the third point is kind of the culmination of these previous 2, because the little we spoke of communist, I don't know, either revolution or socialist transition until now, have been the only new insight we had into this, I think, is the idea that there is a new model for this based on the transformation of system and environment. So rather than transition happens when, rather than communist movements or political movements being a bunch of systems in a capitalist environment, they become the environment within which there still might be capitalist systems. But now the environment makes for capitalists a very harsh ambience, because the cost of being capitalist is now larger than the cost of not being capitalist. So it kind of connects ultimately, right? But the first one is more what is obviously connected to environment as kind of an intuitive idea of ecology and nature. And the later ones try to use those insights, but to take them in a different direction. So I don't intend even to go into this today. The idea today is just to focus on the issue of, okay, but that's how nature appear inside of this whole discussion of the modes and worlds and blah, 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 social world. So how would we situate these concepts of nature, physical world, life, and so on inside our schema, right? I have as usual, as I said, I have a bunch of slides, but my idea is to go very quickly over the first ones because they're kind of just a summary of things we've already discussed. They're going to be mobilized for later stuff, but I don't intend to like go in detail into these things. I do think that there is a nice. I've been very happy with this new way of presenting the basic idea of the logics of worlds, which I think it's a simpler way, less Badiou driven. It doesn't require you to be interested in Badiou for it to make sense or anything, which is something I tried as an approach in a presentation recently, and I felt like it made more sense to people. So it's summarizing these 4 theses plus some sub definitions. Is it readable, guys, in the screen? As it is. So going over them very, very quickly, just for the sake of situating what we're talking about, right? The first thesis, which I think it's nicely framed with this little sentence here, is given a context, not every difference makes a difference, right? So a context, it will count some things and it won't count some things. We call this context where some things make a difference and some things don't make a difference, logical context. And we call the point of view you assume when you see what makes a difference. When you engage with discerning, okay, in the context of a Zoom meeting, the clothing we're wearing at home doesn't matter very much, but if the camera is turned on or turned off, matters more. Or if we're speaking or we're not speaking, matters more. Or what we're talking about matters more, depending on what the meeting is about. Well, that idea, that point of view that helps you to tell what matters and what doesn't matter, that's what we're calling a transcendental point of view. It doesn't have any more profound meaning than that for now, right? So a context differentiates what makes a difference and what doesn't, and you don't need to think about that. But when you do think about that and you take the point of view of making that distinction, which things matter here? That's the transcendental point of view, right? But let's say we want to make this Zoom meeting cohere with a different context, to say that they are the same context. So for example, Caio and I meet on the street and we want to continue discussing the Zoom meeting in the sense that now it forms a bigger context, a context of our meeting in the street and the Zoom call. What needs to happen so that we could say these two form the same space? They're part of the same context, right? So this is the second point. So for logical context to cohere, for them to glue together and form a bigger context, right? Some things are needed. The first thing is what we call the analytic dimension. It means that we need to be able to boil the two contexts down to some things that are the minimal things that matter in that context. So bits of theory, friendly relations, or whatever. But there must be a way to decompose the whole mess of everything that was going on, to extract the things that really made a difference, right? As we were talking about in point A. The things that are, let's say, the smallest things that make a difference. Statements somebody made. Caio said something in the meeting, and when I met him on the street, I went back to the same statement. It doesn't matter what he was dressed as, what he was thinking. So those things don't matter. That statement is the minimal thing. Below that statement, things already don't matter anymore, for example. So you must be able to decompose a logical context into the small bits that are meaningful, below which or around which something doesn't matter anymore. At the same time, there must be a synthetic clause. I must be able to build back from that small stuff and generate again or recapture the things that did matter in the meeting. So if I boil the situation down when I'm talking to him on the street and I talk about, somebody sneezed and somebody else looked sleepy. Well, but if those are the things I take to be the meaningful things that make a difference, if we talk about those things, we might not be able to recuperate what the Zoom meeting was about. So the minimal parts must also have the information about this bigger situations we were talking about, ideas, theories, and so on. And finally, the third thing is that these atomic, what we call these logical atoms, they must have a material basis. They cannot be minimal things that you perceived, but nothing happened or nothing is taking place that is supporting them. So you need to talk about them with me. So we need to repeat the statements on the street. So the sound of your voice needs to carry that information, or it's written on a piece of paper, or you took a print of the slide, but it must have some material support, right? So this, what are we looking at with this section B here? We're just looking at what is the type of thing that needs to happen or operation that needs to happen for small logical context to be able to expand and include more things. If we go closer to the type of thing that interests us, we say something like, I exchange with Caio some commodities. Now Caio meets somebody else on the street. What needs to happen so that when Caio exchanged commodities in the street, he's part of the same economy as when we exchanged commodities between the two of us? And when you try to apply the 3 points I just mentioned, B1, B2, and B3, you will see that money is an atomic, analytic, synthetic component with a material basis that will allow for this to happen. So these very broad things we were discussing, they actually help us to account in which sense, when we're doing economic exchanges, commodity exchange, we're gluing together contexts under a common frame, common logic, right? But then comes point C, which is to make this objective, because it can be totally subjective at first, but the more we glue with other people, other contexts, other conversations, or more we glue commodity exchanges together, the more objective this standard needs to be, because it needs to exist, even though we vary situations and contexts a lot, right? So in order to establish objectivity and coherence, we need to find ways to propagate differences that respect the three clauses. So we need to find ways that every time you find somebody else to exchange commodities or to gossip about the Zoom meeting, you can still propagate the same things that made a difference in the Zoom meeting. Otherwise, otherwise it would just be something different, right? That means that there is no, just because there is a transcendental point of view, just because you can occupy the point of view that tells you what matters and what doesn't, it does not guarantee that you have a synthesis of all these contexts. You need to do work to glue them together. It's not guaranteed that just because you know what matters for commodities, that every context where commodities are involved is the same space. They need to abide to price fluctuations, inflation. They need to abide to the fact that if I exchange something for you for $10, you should only be able to get $10 from it elsewhere, right? So there is natural work of cohering. So this is an important idea because it means that a transcendental point of view under this theory is not the same as a synthetic global cohesion. If global cohesion was, let's say, a subjective thing, then you could say the transcendental subject of a perception glues everything together at the same time that it has a transcendental point of view, just discussing like the Kantian kind of thing. You could claim that one thing leads to the other. If you always see things from the same point of view, they will all be part of the same kind of universe because it's all for you. But if they are being glued together, and even the subjects who are involved change, they're not guaranteed that they're thinking the same thing, they care for the same things. That coherence needs to be further constructed. It's not going to be guaranteed just because I can see it all in my mind's eye from the same point of view. So what is a world from this point of view, from this theory? Well, when you can find a way of gluing things such that I can throw anything at you, or I can throw a lot of things at you, and you will find a way of integrating it into that logical context, then we call that logical context a world. So if I came up with a story, for example, if I come up with a fictional action, John went to the store. That's not a narrative yet, right? Then I glue this to some other fictional action. He went to the store and spoke with a person. That person had something that he wanted to buy. He had already reserved that object before. It's his grandmother's something that he had, sold years ago. Suddenly, like, you can throw something at me, like it's raining, and I can integrate into that story. And it was raining, and then you say, but it wasn't raining. But John felt it was raining because he has a mental problem that doesn't allow him to perceive when it's raining and when it's not. So you can start it. You're now in a fictional world when you can expand it infinitely, and everything will fit inside of it, or a lot of things will fit inside of it, right? So you move from what we could call a big logical context, which is like a bunch of things being glued together, to a world when you can now have an infinite amount of context inside of it. So it's like a point at infinity, right? That's when you get a world. So there is like a jump from here to here for this to be possible, right? So I'm going quickly over this. If you guys want more detail on it, we can stop. But the core of what I wanted to say today, the thing that I think it's the thing we would be analyzing in more detail, it's how this thing here features inside all these ideas, right? So what does it mean for something to have a material basis? So that's kind of the key idea, which will help us move into the discussion of nature and so on. So I drew this thing that has been helping me a lot. This is like a little anatomy of what an atom of a context could look like, right? So what is this? You can imagine it like this. Remember, I said that there is an analytic clause. You should be able to decompose a context into its smaller parts, right? You're decomposing based on some point of view. And I said that it needs to be able to be recomposed, right? It must have a syntactic, I don't know how to write sentences, fuck it. Okay, syntactic point of view. I think there's no, yeah, whatever. And the third condition is that it has material support. So what does material support mean? It means, for example, let's use an example that I gave before. I exchange a commodity with Caio, right? So we can decompose the value of these commodities and talk about the price of these commodities. And we can integrate the part of this commodity. So let's say it's I don't know, something that has parts to make it easier. So it's a computer, right? You're buying a computer. Yeah, but we can talk about the value of the parts of the computer. We can talk about how much you could get for the parts. And well, in that case, even though you paid me 1,000, you can talk about how much 500 valued, 25, 5, even $1, and so on. So we can recompose the discussion. But everything you're pricing is indexed on something of the computer. So the whole computer, the screen, the processor, the chips inside the computer, or whatever, right? How can we think about that? We can think about that in the following terms. Even though it exists in this world as a commodity, right? So it makes a difference as a commodity. So it only counts in the commodity world if it has use value for others. So if I were to break a part of my computer, like a little chip part that now has no use, and I say, how much is the value of this? You'll tell me, I don't know, nothing. There's no use to this. There's no use value. So how can there be value? It doesn't exist, but it was there as part of the computer, right? So how can you think about this? You can imagine that The material support, it's something that has many differences in it, right? It has all the parts that are commodified, but all the parts that are not relevant for commodities. They're relevant for the electronics. They're relevant aesthetically. They're relevant just from the physical standpoint that there is an extensive object with, weight and height or whatever. So the material support needs to have a difference that can propagate the difference that we are talking about. So when you talk about the use value, you're picking some differences that are in the material computer, and they are the ones that support the logic of the commodity. Some other things could change, it wouldn't matter. Like if I change the specific atoms of carbon that go into the computer, you wouldn't care. It does the same thing as the same computer, right? I could even change the chips and you wouldn't, in a way that you wouldn't know, that doesn't change the performance of the computer, it wouldn't matter. So those differences don't make a difference, but some do, about how the computer is arranged, what it does, and so on. So this is the difference between the orange thing here, which is the material support, and the green arrow here. You can imagine it as almost like the material has a bunch of arrows. And what happens is that when it becomes caught up in the context, it becomes conducive to the difference that makes a difference to that context, right? So for example, I'm speaking to you now, I have a bit of an accent, I have, my own tone of voice. Some of these things don't matter for what I'm saying, but the fact that I'm able to use some phonemes rather than others matters because that propagates the difference that makes a difference as I speak on Zoom. So all these differences are part of the material support, but just some differences rather than other propagate this downward and upward movement that connects this into the context, right? To give a different example, like if we give a handshake, it has a logical meaning in a social situation of we're introduced, now we're minimally aware of each other in a friendly way. Well, I can shake your hand in many, many ways that don't make a difference, like the slight kind of details of how we do it, as far as we did shake the hand, right? So the material support has its bigger variation, but insofar as it's enough to propagate a difference, a specific difference, that variation can remain in the background, right? So that's how we can distinguish what we could call existence from what we call the material support. Existence is the difference that makes a difference. Material is the set of all differences that are there, some of which maintain the relevant existing difference, right? So why did I add the gray thing here? Because what I said here is that we're decomposing some, so for example, the hand gesture, right, into its parts. So I spoke with you, we shook hands, and this it will then feature into bigger things. We will say, yeah, and of course I know Gabriel, I shook his hand yesterday and so on. It's part of the whole context of friendship or whatever, right? But I can, even though some of the things that I didn't matter at the time, so how I shook your hand didn't matter, some things could still matter. We could still, let's say, decompose the handshake a bit further and capture some of the stuff that happened. So for example, you could tell someone else, no, I shook his hand, yeah, fine. But now that I think of it, it was a bit of a sleazy handshake, like a weak handshake. So the fact that it was weak or strong didn't matter. Later on, as part of the world of affinity and friendliness, you're talking to somebody else, and you can go even further into the material support of that gesture, right? And you can decompose that existence into smaller ones that still matter in the context. Or for example, I'm presenting something on Zoom. As I'm presenting, it doesn't matter that I stutter. Later on, you want to tell somebody, yeah, but perhaps Gabriel was insecure about what he was saying. He did stutter. You are pointing to something that is material because you're pointing at a difference that was part of the background in what I said, right? But that you can access it by decomposing further what's going on, if you find the appropriate means to do it. So you have to justify why it's relevant, why it's not relevant, and so on, right? The other aspect of what I'm calling the material is that, so there is one aspect which is that you can decompose what is relevant to arrive at it. You can extract more stuff from it, but also it is made of things that are black boxed in a way. So for example, the physiology of my hand, the fact that I can grip your hand, that's kind of irrelevant for friendship. Like, it's necessary that it's there. If I don't have a hand with all the bones in it, I cannot shake your hand. But the logic of how hands move, it's totally irrelevant for the world of friendship, right? It's kind of black boxed. It needs to be there, but you can't open it and take things out of it. If you want to decompose the logic of how my hand works, you need to go into physiology. You need to go into medicine. You need to go into a different context, right? So a material is something we could say it's kind of a black box, also at the limit, where you don't know what's inside of it, right? But you know that you need to go through this and you get an output that is relevant, right? So this is relevant. We need to shake hands. You can use the shaking of the hand as a propagator of a relevant act of friendship, and this makes the world of friendship work. But if I ask you, like, which muscles moved when you shook my hand, like, that's not a relevant question, right? So it's necessary, but it's black boxed. It's there, but as a kind of obscure process that if you wanted to understand what's inside of it, you would have to change context to understand it. For example, sexual reproduction is necessary for the propagation of kinship in some situations, but the inner biological logic, physiological rule of how sexual reproduction happens is not part of the world of kinship. It's to open that black box, you need to look somewhere else, right? So that's what makes the material the material. We can call just, let's say, the support or the material support, the being behind that material support, just the set of everything that is part of that material that might be accessible only in a different world and not in that one. So the fact that this is a handshake, it has some things that I can use, decompose and recompose here about how the handshake was. The fact that it happened is, part of the world as well. But when we start going into the fact that, there is the physiology of hands, I wonder physiology of hands, or the physics, why is there pressure in that context, right? Even other things. All those things, you can unbox those dimensions that were there, but if you do unbox them, you would have to go to a different context that doesn't glue with the original one, right? For example, if I'm shaking your hand, and as I'm shaking it, you say, you have a very soft grip. Have you been eating properly today? Because, there is this problem with some protein deficiency. You would break the act. It would mean something else. We move to like a medical discourse, and you put into question if that, the social pact was valid or not. So being here is just a relative term for everything that is not existing. So here are the differences that make a difference. Here is everything that is indifferent to that situation, right? And material is a relative term of all the things that are indifferent, but are still necessary. So, and they come in two flavors, right? They can be opened, some of these boxes, like the details of how I spoke, the details of how we shook hands, and some of them can only be opened if you go to a different context. They cannot be made different there, right? So a lot of what we call material basis has this structure. Like, very nice that you're watching a movie, but did you know that this was made by workers by destroying, cellulose trees in the Amazon, eucalyptus or whatever? Like, what did you just do? You changed worlds. You moved out of the world of the movie and aesthetic appreciation. You referred back to things that are indifferent to that world, but are there. The destruction of trees to make whatever thing, latex, and the fact that people were working, and now you push this to a different world, the world of the forces of production, relations of production, and class struggle, and so on. So when we do that operation of pointing to the material basis, sometimes we're pointing to the details at the margin of something, like, yeah, but pay attention to the, to how the images are on the screen. Don't do like such a idealist analysis of the movie. Realize that there is some support specific to this. It's not just a logical thing. It's not just a figure. It has details or whatever, but you use the material also to move outside of that context and to bring into play something that was a black box in that context, right? So you can see it. Basically what you have is this idea of being, which is just, let's say, a bunch of indifferent differences, existence, the differences that make a difference, and material is just a relative term because it depends on the existence. So it's those indifferent differences that you can access through the world. They might bring you back there, or they might send you to a different context, right? What did I call the real here? Just so we have a use for this word as well, because it seems like we're making a list of all the cool philosophical words, like existence, being, material. So why not real? We could call real the part of being that will never be integrated into that world. So you can never decompose this enough and recompose it back and capture this thing here. So I'll give examples of this as we go along. It's a secondary thing, but so every time we talk about this thing here, this point P2 here, for a logical context to be constructed, and for the conversation on Zoom to be connected to the conversation on the street, and there are conditions for this, what we're talking about are the construction of these things. So if I want a conversation on the street to glue together with a Zoom conversation, I need to be able to decompose it under the same criteria, recompose it under the same criteria. It needs to have a material support that makes the right differences count and separate them from things that are indifferent. And these things need to match the Zoom conversation. So if on Zoom we were talking about something and then we stop talking about it on the street, like you ask me how I'm doing, we talk about other things, then it's not part of the Zoom conversation, right? It's just another conversation. You need to preserve the same differences and preserve the same indifferences. So it just shows that there is an act behind all of this, and it just puts into play all these classic concepts that we will be using one way or another as we move forward. Then this is something that we started discussing, but I think it's still a work in progress, but it's a nice idea that I think with the last text, we started giving some attention to this, which is, okay, but logical contexts, worlds in this very broad sense, but what makes a world a social world? So in which case would this be a social thing? And these are, I think, is the current okay hypothesis for now. I'll try to expand on it today, but it's an okay kind of approach for now. So the first thing is to say that social is not the same thing as involving humans, not even involving many people. So a crowded room is not necessarily a social situation, a social context, right? And it's not just because people are involved that they're doing social things. First hypothesis would be to say that it's a type, so a specific type of interdependence between living systems. So you need to have living things, it's the first condition. They need to be dependent on each other, second condition. And this dependence needs to be of one type. It's not just depending, right? So we can distinguish three types of interdependence, the basic ones. The first one is to say, just think of an organism. An organism has parts that are living, which are the organs, right? And they depend on each other. So if you have an organ here and you have another organ here, something is coming in here, it's going to go through this is going to expel, but also make this exist. And all of this exists inside a living creature, right? So the whole is living and the parts are living. That's something specific about what we call organic interdependence, right? So organic means that the whole is a living thing and the parts are living things. The parts interdepend on each other and the whole interdepends on the parts. And they're all kind of connected. The second type of interdependence is what we call ecological interdependence. It's still not social. Why? Because even though the ecosystem itself is not a living thing, and the parts of it are living systems, the living organisms, even though they depend on each other, they are doing their own thing, and their own thing, which is trying to survive, helps each other more, helps each other less. So they depend on each other, but in an almost we could call formal subsumption sense. They externally depend on each other in the sense that, it becomes clear when you compare with the social system, but they depend on each other while only being concerned with their own survival. So this creature is concerned with them surviving, this creature is concerned with them surviving, but in doing this, they interact, right? And this is a non-living system. It's a whole space, includes minerals, includes a bunch of things, right? Then we come to what we think, I think it's a good hypothesis for what makes a social system. So a social system is, first of all, the whole is not a living thing, but the survival of the parts is impossible alone. So they are not directly concerned with their survival. They do something and they interact with each other. And just because of what they do collectively, they get their survival assured from above almost, right? So a social system is not a living system. It is composed of living parts that are not directly determined by their individual survival. So this is where division of labor comes in, for example. Because division of labor means that I'm not doing everything I need to do to survive. I do something, I take on a function, someone else takes on a function. None of these functions puts food on our table directly, but the collection of all these things put foods on our table. So, for example, if you had a bird that takes a branch of a tree every day and throws somewhere, and because of this, it falls in the mouth of some other animal that shits something, that shit becomes a tree, and the tree drops a fruit in the bird's nest, you would call that a social system. Because the action of cutting a branch of the tree is not feeding the bird. They cannot eat the branch. But the branch goes to somewhere, and then they get the fruit, right? So the function is defined by the whole. It's a downward definition of functions. That's how the division of labor works. Division of labor in the most basic sense is the fact that we will split functions, not based on what I need to directly survive. We will split functions so that the combination of our activities guarantees our survival. So you will chop off trees, he will cut the wood, he will make a fire. Chopping of trees, cutting the wood, making the fire, none of those things guarantee survival, right? So this is where social interdependence is different from ecological interdependence. So in a social system, differences that make a difference for a living individual and those that make a difference for the sociological space diverge. Like, I need food. That makes a big difference for me, right? But what makes a difference for a system that has a distribution and division of labor, for example, is not that I do what I immediately need, which is to eat, but that I get people's money when they enter a bus and give them the change correctly. Like, what does that have to do with eating? Nothing. But if I do that, I get the money. If I get the money, I then can buy some food, right? So it's a mixture of interdependence on others via the combination of everyone. So the combination doesn't come afterward. It's not a group of many people concerned with their survival. What it means to be concerned with your survival is determined by the group, right? So if you really cared about eating, you wouldn't be in front of the supermarket the whole day. You would be working, because then you would have money to go into the supermarket, right? And because of this divergence, because what makes a difference for the social space is not what makes a difference for you as a living creature, social context cannot count on immediate survival as the basis for propagating relevant social difference. Actually, it's the contrary, right? If I'm too concerned with surviving now, I'm hungry, I'm gonna eat. That's gonna get in the way of you actually eating, because to actually eat, you need to postpone the concern with hunger so you can work, so you can get the money, so you can buy the food, right? So social worlds need to be very, very plastic. They need to find in these living creatures and what they do, differences that make social difference, that glue us back into social reproduction. That's pretty much a theory of social reproduction, this whole thing, right? It's a difference between species reproduction, living reproduction, or whatever. It's just, it goes through the social space, right? I'm going to skip this very crazy one here, where I think we can derive the difference between, like, what is an ecology, what is physics, what is social worlds, from the difference between how material these things. I think we can discuss them later if we have more time. But the whole point here is just that, okay, we have a working idea of what social means. It means that we're gonna use these living creatures here and their actions to propagate social differences that, when they cohere, they're synthesized, this creature here gets what it needs, but it doesn't get directly from what the system wants, like this, right? There is already something we could talk about in terms of how this idea of divergence between the natural reproduction of a creature or a species or whatever, and the social reproduction, and how it's deviating or using features of living creatures to propagate something else, which is this social interdependence. How this connects with the fact that what we call the multiplicity principle, the fact that it seems like it's a special characteristic of social worlds, that they have many logics rather than just one. Because it makes sense that if you cannot count on the living reproduction of individuals to propagate social differences, you need to be very plastic on how you do it, right? You need to find subsystems in living creatures, or you need to find specific behaviors we have that are conductive to keeping those logical contexts or sociological contexts cohering. Because only if they cohere, and I give you I sell you a commodity, you sell somebody else the commodity, then you eat, right? I buy your labor, I pay you money. If you cannot use that money in a different context to buy food, you die. So the social coherence between contexts is now tangled with your reproduction as a living creature, right? So, well, we better be able to glue contexts together, right? So just to show that the kind of epistemology of it, the capacity to see the same in the different is glued to survival. It's not an additional dimension. The capacity to make this transcendental structure cohere and the fact that I spend effort and I need to be rewarded later on with food, these things are the same problem, right? This makes the economic problem a logical problem. So, I mean, we haven't developed this very well, but I would say it's a pretty good reason for us to develop a social system based on any logic we could find, right? And our current idea, which is taken from Karatani, but we've been developing it further, is that yes, the fact is that throw any logic at us. So interact with me in a way that is very clear cut. Interact with me in a way that is entangles us together, or interact with me in a way that there is a fuzzy gradient of, in this process. Any of these things, we need to be able to glue back to this world because our survival depends on it. So being good logicians is a good survival skill in that sense, right? So that's a good reason why any logic we know, and we only know of 3 basic logics, they would all be connected to this, right? This here is just a classic thing where we just discuss, right, the 3 modes that Karatani presents. We have already talked a lot about the different properties they have. For a year or so now, we've been associating them with these different structures here. I'll try not to be overly reliant on this. I think that the first nice thing we realized was that you can associate affinity with paraconsistency, property with classical logic, and value with intuitionistic logic. Then a second insight we had is that these logics, they are connected to different definitions of topology. So from a closed set topology, you get paraconsistent spaces. From closed set topology, you get classical, and open set, you get intuitionistic. So that was nice. The intuitive explanation of this, which I think it's also a good thing we found out, is basically that on closed set topologies pretty much means that anything you create has boundaries. Meaning if you have an interval and you have this interval here, the point here that is at the limit of both of them belongs to both of them. So it creates a paradox. If I say that this is, let's say, blue and this is not blue, the set blue and the set not blue share a point in common. So it's kind of a contradiction, right? And we can talk about classic logic as establishing cuts rather than boundaries. So when I say something is blue and I know everything that belongs to the set, the complement of that set is not a closed set. So you just have a cut with no boundary being shared, right? So it's nice to make that distinction between boundaries and cuts. And then intuitionism is like you have margins for sets, right? So if I say that this thing here has some property, well, if this is blue and this is not blue, there can be, for example, a little area here that is kind of indecidable. It's at the margin of blue. It's already on the not blue side. It's perhaps more to the green or whatever, right? But you can just summarize this like the formal part in terms of thinking in terms of boundaries, cuts, and margins. And the new insight we had recently, we're still working on this, but I think it's also useful, is that you can think of this, the same 3 logics, in terms of decompositions of a graph. I think it was Renzo and I'm not sure if it's John who found this paper or Dennis, but what they do there is they show an example, which is like this. Let me see if I can zoom in perhaps. They show this little graph and they tell you, imagine you want to cut it into smaller graphs, okay? Well, there are kind of 3 ways you can do this. The first one, imagine that we have a set S, okay? So it's as if I came here and said A, B, C, and D, these are going to form a set. We're going to call this S. What is outside of S? What is the negation of S? And what they show is that, well, the 3 different negations you could make of this S give you the 3 different logics. So if you were to say that this last node, right, that is inside of S, it's included in the set of everything that is outside of S. Because if you see, if I remove this D here, this arrow doesn't go anywhere, right? Like I have F, I have G, and F goes to E, and the negation of F would be an inconsistent graph. It requires a node here. So it's a good reason to include it. But if I included it twice. I included it on the original decomposition and on the negation, because I also had to include it to make this into a consistent graph. So I created a boundary here. But you can also decompose it by saying, no, fuck that. If D is in S, I'm gonna have as the counterpart something which doesn't include D. Everything that's not S. Well, it's actually a inconsistent graph, right? So it's a very symmetric, because now the negation of our subgraph, as it's called, this little part of it, is not a proper part. It doesn't exist as such, because E, I couldn't just write something like this. E, and this is G. You would say, there's something missing here. This is not a not correct construction, right? So you just create a cup here. So this is a different way of negating S, right? And the third way of negating S is saying, okay, so let's just go to the smallest thing, to the biggest thing that is not intersecting with S. So yes, you're right, I cannot add E, because as we just said, this thing here is not correct. But why don't I just remove this as well and just stay with this? This is a different negation of S. So what these guys show is that you can actually decompose, and it has the property of having a bit of a margin. Like, I mean, I'm being a bit overly intuitive here, but you get the idea of margin here because there is like a weird void here. You do get the idea, again, it's a bit too intuitive. It wouldn't be a good way of describing it technically, but you do get the idea that nothing is shared here. And you get the feeling that this is asymmetric because this exists and this is not a graph, like a cut. And here you get the weird paradox, because this is S, but to create a consistent disjunct graph, I had to create say they share something. So though this is disjunct from this, they share a boundary, right? So this is already a nice kind of insight. I think for me, it has a lot of nice formal intuitive things to think about. It could be helpful for us to make these ideas clear, but it's also nice because it's a process-based description of these logics. Right? These are processes. This thing can be doing B and then doing C to D, while F is doing G and doing E to F. They're like interacting. And we're able to tell if that interaction is being decomposed in a mode A, mode B, or mode C, depending on how they are split, right? So it seems it's still early stages, but it seems promising, right? So the whole point is that this is where we've been thus far, that we try to define a world as the mixture of these three modes of interchange, right? But what this little approach with the graphs helps to nail down, I think, is that we're not just talking about exchange when we're talking about this logical context. So not just necessarily talking about something symbolic, like the meaning needs to match, right? We can talk about intercourse or material exchange, which is actually how Karatani wanted us to understand these modes to begin with, right? Like very early on in the structure of world history, he quotes Moses Hess, and Moscardi also starts the Seeing Nature section of the Atlas talking about this quote and this idea that has had a return through a lot of ecologically minded Marxists of paying attention to the fact that Marx was not reducing the logic of capitalism to a sort of symbolic logic of exchange. For him, the Stoffwechsel, so the change or the transformation in the material things that are involved, including human beings, but not only human beings, including other resources and natural resources, so on, all these things they do take the form of value. They are imprinted, they are conditioned by the commodity logic. So we cannot describe logic only as if it's a matter of these symbolic relations. We need to have a theory of what these things are, that we can see propagating itself, right? Finding a conductive difference within nature, within the material supports. So it connects with that thing, why I was talking about the material existence stuff we were talking early on, and the fact that we are searching for a way to propagate, to continue looking into these different logics as we look into material transformation. Like, can we track and tell apart how material transformations are themselves more or less conductive to different logics, right? So this is pretty much the way that that Hess talks about this. He talks about the intercourse of man, and he has this double theory, I'd say, that Karatani adopts, and that I think it's very much Marxist theory. If you read the way that the chapters on cooperation, machinery, and industrialization work, cooperation, manufacture, and machinery works, it follows this idea that first you have a social logic, and then that logic seeps or is expanded or is latches on to anything, right? So the idea that man's relation to nature's intercourse, its material exchange, this sort of relation between man and nature necessarily takes place by way of a kind of social relation between people. This too consists of a kind of intercourse. So it's a weird thing, because if it's a more process or material-based idea, intercourse, not just so symbolic relations, but it's also centered on the idea that, yeah, but it propagates out of the social relations between humans into the rest of the world. It's not just spontaneously born out of matter, right? So it has this double idea. Let's make it more material, but also let's track how it moves from social relations between people into social relations between people and nature. And we will try to show even relations between nature with itself, not necessarily with man. So this is another way of putting it, which is these processes in this little box here, they can take place between humans and non-human actors, between only non-human actors. None of that matters, right? What the modes ABC define is that whatever processes or interactions these are, in order to be socially integrated under a given mode, they must be amenable to consistently being decomposed and recomposed in according to the mode's logic. So I don't care if it starts with a very symbolic act, which has like very little traction on its material, it's a meaning of a gesture, and then this leads you to kickstart some very automatic or physical causal process. So we moved from a matter of how we reason about things and conceptualize to something that is much closer to causality. Well, in the end, if the output of this preserves some properties, I'll be able to integrate the symbolic with that material output, and they will be logically coherent, right? So we cannot make it rain. It rains when it wants, but the fact that when it rains, the infrastructure of a city makes life worse for some people much more than others, and that division is already accounted socially by class struggle, makes it that the rain is perfectly, oh my God, yes, it flooded. That's really terrible. You should talk to your representative about, doing something, and then life goes on, because it's totally coded so that something that is totally asocial, in the sense it's a causal process we can't even predict, we can still integrate it, right? So the nice thing, I think, the basic insight here is that it's more about making sure these pieces, well, if this is, a system and we're under mode A, we know that if this is going to be another system, that it, if it is to be a negation of the first one, it better include D, right? But let's say this is not a human shaking my hand. This is the way that I hunt, and this is a different animal. Well, if the way we interact creates a boundary between us, it will be coherent. And if it's not about how we interact, it's about how I frame the interaction between a creature and a third creature that I'm not hunting. So it's not me hunting the deer, it's me looking at the lion hunting the deer. if I can frame it coherently in a way that preserves mode A, I'll be able to integrate that into the social context we're talking about, right? And we'll be able to say, yeah, I hunt you, but then we share something. When you hunt the deer, the lion also shares something with the deer, and these things then cohere, right? So even though you start, let's say, with humans and humans, you need to propagate this to humans and non-humans to make this context more robust. And you even need to propagate this to non-humans interacting to non-humans to make this even more robust. That nothing in this schema here tells us that you can only interact with people and that's how it remains consistent, right? The necessity is that insofar as our living structure, social structure is concerned, our social world, all these things match logically. And if this is a mode A thing, that this match mode A, as far as differences make a difference. We can black box everything that doesn't make a difference, right? It doesn't mean that everything is structured in this way, but we will start looking that the meaningful things are. So why is it that, for example, for systems where mode B is most relevant, the thing that matters the most, for example, when it comes to hereditarity and getting inheritance from your parents is, are you registered correctly? Can I prove you are his kid? I can either you are somebody's kid or not. There is no, but you're more or less their kid. No, you are or you aren't. That's the thing that they pick from human reproduction. Whereas if affinity is at the core, the thing that will matter the most from human reproduction might be something else, which is, yeah, you're somebody's kid, but you're also the father of the next generation. So you're a boundary between two generations. So you start parsing out non-social things and selecting this non-social difference, meaning the material differences, to give relevance to those that are conductive to the logic that is ruling that context. Does that make sense? So I think, yeah, I think this could be developed much further, but I think it's a good way to start getting a feel for that. So the idea is the logical consistent, basically this is a summary of what we just said. The logical consistent of the social atom relies on there being a material support that, even if its inner workings are not fully compatible, as a black box, it supports the logic of the world in a coherent way. So I don't need to know, let's see if I can zoom in here. I don't need to know everything about the material process that is propagating the difference that makes a difference. It can be a black box. I don't know anything about how, the creatures we hunt, how they are actually organized. That doesn't matter. If the input that goes into them when I hunt them and the output that comes, how that affects the biome, is coherent with the logic that we relate to each other and that we need to do so in order to get food on the table, that's a coherent structure that now includes other creatures, right? So I came up with very rudimentary and stupid examples, but just to give that kind of sense of how this could be used. So imagine you have a bunch of clans. You can decompose them into the families and the people who are part of the clans, right? That's one of the principles of logic of affinity. So for example, you can have as a difference that makes a difference, a family's generation. So the parents and the kid, right? And clans can be decomposed and they can remarry in many ways and form new kinds of kinship relations, right? But this needs to have some material support. So the fact that contingently human physiology is such that you can take two people, but nature doesn't tell you which two people, right? And they can produce a third person, and that third person comes out of them, but it still has their features. So is in a way outside, but it's still kind of inside, and can itself marry to another person, and in that way carry those features into a third party. That's just contingent fact, right? But we could be a social species that didn't have sexual reproduction. That wouldn't be a problem. But it just so happens that this is good because this has a kind of paraconsistent feature, right? You have like a father and a mother, then you have a son. and then the son can meet somebody else here, and they can have a daughter or whatever, right? So this is one family, this is a different family, but this person is here at the boundary. And this is an insight that Lévi-Strauss had that I find it totally crazy. Like people, there is an obvious, much more conservative anthropology that would say, no, the logic of affinity was born out of the logic of reproduction, human reproduction. First, we reproduced as a species, and then, like exogamy is because of not sharing DNA or whatever. And Lévi-Strauss says, no, it's the inverse. The logic of kinship is more important than the natural support of kinship, which is consanguinity, right? Consanguinity, the fact that you need to mix blood, is just a good material support to propagate kinship. But we can propagate kinship without that if you have the means of keeping track of it. And the bonds are the same. So the first thing that he did was to show that the consanguinity aspect is the contingent one that is good because it propagates the kinship which is actually the core logic at stake, right? The logic at stake is not, you cannot learn anything about how humans organize by thinking in terms of consanguinity, but you can see how we use consanguinity by looking at kinship. And what we can say is that more recent anthropologists show that even kinship, so coherent structures of parental relations, forming clans and groups, that's just a very good technology for keeping track of affinity, which is an even more fundamental category. But it's too untamed, it's too inconsistent, or to put it in Vivero's terms, it's too inconstant. The inconstance of the wild soul, right? I don't know how the inconstância da alma selvagem. Affinity is too inconsistent because it's paraconsistent. In fact, kinship gives it a bit more structure. Consanguinity helps to propagate kinship. But the true transcendental point of view is that of affinity. And you can see that you can use a lot of different material supports to propagate the logic of affinity, right? In the case of a clan decomposing into people and you want to generate new kinship relations, the fact that humans are equipped with this weird sexuality that has something to do with combining two and making one and so on and so forth, it's a good propagator for that. But the fact that there are other things in humans that are just totally disconnected, that's actually something you can never integrate into affinity. So there is something that it's hard to bring back into affinity. And I just put it like this here. But for example, Karatani says that this is for him where the domination of mode B comes from, because it's very hard for big assortments of people organized around the mode A to meet a stranger that doesn't want to be not even your enemy, right? Like they don't want to kill you with honor. They want to enslave you. That's even worse than that. That's the cut in a logic of boundaries, right? And there's nothing you can do. That's a real point that gets in the way. But we can do the same thing and you'll see the different things come into play. So with the logic of property, imagine we have a bunch of assets, right? A bunch of goods and properties and so on. We can decompose them and just get the individual properties or get them, a part of a property. And we want to, for example, do things with those properties, rent them out, sell them, alienate them in this and that way. Well, if I want to alienate a property of a land property, I need to be able to find a support that I can cut, right? So I need a technology that takes land and is able to put a wall here and a wall here with a little flag, right? That says that this part here is totally separated from the parts that are outside. If I don't have this technology, or if land is not extensionally stable, if land were to change, all the time and make this impossible, I couldn't really do it, right? But you can even, this is the really interesting thing. We'll go back to this in a bit, but property is always with this problem. Property of physical things is always messy if they're not made to be property. So when we make a cell phone, it's already made to be a self-enclosed thing that I can remove from an environment and leave nothing behind. But natural properties, natural things, that are just there, we didn't fabricate them to be properties, they are very resistant to that, because what's the exact limit of a boundary that I put on a terrain, right? And what about below the soil? Like when if I own a piece of land on the earth, do I own it like this all the way to the core of the earth? Or do I only own it here and somebody could own it below it? You know, like it's always complicated. That's why it's always more real on the paper than on the physical space. And it's more real because, again, if you take a piece of paper and a writing, either it's written or it's not written. So it's, again, very classical and therefore very conductive to the logic of property. And the fact that parts of the world are interdependent, and I can buy a terrain, well, it can rain in a terrain, a tsunami can go over it and you lose everything. And you're like, who is going to refund me? And you're like, you didn't buy a totally alienatable thing. You don't have that power. So interdependency is kind of like the real, again, something that cannot be totally integrated into the logic of the material that is conductive to differences that make a difference in that context, right? Same thing with value. You buy a bunch of commodities like means of production, labor, power. You want to decompose them into actions, into little gestures, into production process, right? Because you want to get a product out of it on the other side. And you want this process to have a form that makes sure that this context is gluable to this context. So the money I put here exists here, right? This is exactly Marx's formula, right? And means of production plus labor power, 3 dots, a commodity on the other side. And capital is ready to reorganize material. The fact that you can decompose objects radically and recompose them in new ways, this is a material support that helps the production process. The fact that humans can do many actions, right? And not like a set of 3 actions that are only 3 things we can do, is very conductive to this logic, right? But the fact that some of the things we can do don't have any use. So I can always cut my computer into smaller parts that are priceable, as I was talking in my exchange with Caio, but I could hammer the computer in a way that's not even, it cannot even be sold as scrap metal, but could be in an art gallery. So there is something that creates a disjunction between use and dysfunction that is hard to integrate directly back, right? I mean, these purple things are not meant to be the real of the things. It's just an example for this particular example that I'm giving. But I hope that this helps to see the connection between material basis having to have certain properties. It can have many other properties, many other differences, but some of its differences are conductive to the logic at stake, right? Other differences might not be conductive. But as far as the ones that are present, that logic can propagate in that way. You can explain, and I think that this is part of a very nice account of racial capitalism by, I think, Olufemi Tayo, but other people worked on this, almost like a simulation and an argument of why, even if it is contingent, that a side product of a longer period of colonization is to attach poverty to bodies that have a specific racial marking, that propagates a capitalist trait very neatly about managing surplus population, how to see inequality and continue to recognize it in a coherent way. So you can explain a lot, and it's a weird mixture of Foucault with Marx, which is actually in neither of them, this approach, right? But it's this idea that you can take advantage of differences, or you can even restrict them further to make them more salient, so that material processes, material exchanges with the world propagate logical traits that allow those social contexts we were talking about to cohere, right? I mean, if the world was just, and I mean, I think you can always do this, it works for the 3 modes. I think at once we had that idea even, like, if you had to make every affinity context cohere only on the basis of affinity, it would be mayhem. So you're my friend, he's my enemy. Now I meet a new person. Are they my friend or my enemy? I don't know, because I don't know everyone they know. So I need to know all of this to make sure that this mapping is consistent. If affinity now goes through consanguinity, so I don't know who you are, but you are the son of whoever, I recuperate all that information. If you're the son, if I'm Romeo and you're Juliet, then you're the son of that family. That means that I hate you by definition, and I hate everyone in your family. I already know everything. It's epistemologically less costly, cognitively cheaper, right? Because then you can tie any context. If I need to exchange commodities with you, and we don't know what commodities are, I just take whatever's around me and I check with you if you want to buy it or not. To make the economic space cohere is very hard. But if we produce things as commodities, meaning even in the process of production, we know how much they cost, it's much easier to make sure everything you buy has a price that is coherent with other prices, right? If I create logistical lineaments that guarantee where are the cuts in every social space, what belongs to whom, where can you go, where can't you go, all that is previously set, it's much easier to then know which properties are yours, which are not, as you engage with these different contexts. So going through the material and imprinting the material in such a way that it conduces the right differences is necessary for the further scaling of a system. Does that make sense, guys? Kyle made like a...
I'm sorry. I don't think I got the last part, because I'm thinking of, at the same time, what would be in this logic, how do I distinguish, or where would I put, for example, the materiality of law, for example, how law would be able to affect law in the sense, let's say in kinship, but then at the same time in the production of what is or what is not property, where it goes in the extension, and then in value, like as to how to value one thing or another.
You mean the law in the sense of the general principle of each of these things?
Yeah, but at the same time, later, I think would it be possible to fit into one of these, where law, like in the strict sense, like as we see it today, and as part of capital, where it would be?
Yeah, I think, the modern law would have to be the mixture of the three things, right? But I think it's mostly this. You can check, right? What are laws work through writing mostly, like the main support is writing, police, enclosures of people and land, borders, right? Definition of the exact punishment for a crime, things like this. So it's very classical, right? Of course, you can see that this is not the case, because modern law is very nuanced. For example, it has a sense of cost for actions that is value-like, right? You can take different levels of penalty, for example, and things like this. And so it has a mediating role. But if I were to suggest something, I'd say that the law is like the example of a broad system of how to track property.
Even with how jurisprudence works today, to some extent, I don't know if we could say it, to some extent it might be like paraconsistent, in the sense that depending on one line, one ideology, and one let's say alignment, there could be one interpretation, but there could be another one as well. The way it's revisiting, right, itself.
Yeah, I think this, we're totally lagging behind on giving like a nice interpretation of law and a good account of it. I think that this is totally true. Like you have, perhaps we could say like there is a core structure of the law that is very connected to the history of state and property. But you can see that, for example, there is an aspect of the law that is all about the case-to-case basis of stitching it together back to the law but mediating with value and affinity. So you need to find interpretation that will have communitarian consent, because it cannot be totally dissentful. So you need judges, you need figures, you need this and that, but you also need to constantly be at the service of something, because property and state are at the service of capital. So it's much more complicated than just saying it's mode B, right? But I think, again, the material, I mean, I don't intend these little examples to give like the material of affinities. The whole point is that there is no such thing as a material basis. Is a relative term to the difference that makes a difference, right? So if in a contract, what makes a difference is the fact it was signed, the relevant material basis is the fact that ink either is on paper or is not. Either a word counts as a legible thing or it doesn't, right? It's a good conductive criteria for that contract. So the material basis of that contract has something to do with the fact that amongst the physical laws, there is chemistry, saying that, well, the diffusion of ink on a paper is of such quickness that it quickly imprints on the paper. That's like a boxed procedure. It doesn't matter for the law, but it requires that if it needs to set something down. It couldn't be like just a spoken agreement, right? But then you have computers and it's a digital thing, it's even better. Again, it's either written or it's not written, and again, you get it. Like, it's a good support, right? So I think it's not a matter also of finding like the answer for this. It's actually giving a tool for analyzing context by context, right? But then we can already say some bigger things from this, right? So what the summary of this is that, so social atoms are necessarily localized on living systems. So by our definition of social means that it is a system of interdependence of living creatures, and that the reproduction of these creatures is guaranteed by the logic of the social world. So they have a vested survival interest in a logical coherence. They cannot just throw it out there to the world, like, I will eat whatever is in my vicinity, expel it, and then when I'm hungry again, I'll eat what's in my vicinity. I don't need to make myself responsible for the environment I'm in. It will just arrange itself towards an equilibrium where things are more or less coherent due to evolution, right? That external logical structure is part of what guarantees that you get food on the table, right? But one can generate new social parts out of these necessary ones. So though the living systems that we mentioned need to be included, other parts can be created, right? So parts of these living systems that do not correspond to any biologically relevant component. This is the basis for division of labor. Like, me as an individual who is just concerned with my own reproduction, I mean, there are some actions I need to do in order to get my reproduction guaranteed. Hunting, eating, I don't know, whatever, right? Once you're part of a social world, you might be decomposed into parts and into actions that have no direct bearing on your survival. So the social world divides a living system into something which is not relevant for its survival. For example, I'm a person, I need this and this and that, but I also now need to get the raw material needed for making shoes, because I need to make shoes so I get the money so I survive. The set of things I need to do to make a shoe have nothing to do with my survival. I won't be able to eat the shoe afterwards, right? So it decomposes you, it discerns you in ways that only make sense inside the social context. They don't make sense for you as a living creature, right? But they also can generate social parts, which are living systems whose reproduction is not fully or not even partially dependent on the social world in question. So once we are integrated into a social world, nothing prevents me from integrating contexts that concern other living systems whose own reproduction is not going through the social system. So I need to hunt deer. The deer eats some vegetables, some trees or whatever, some grass that I don't even know where it is, right? So the deer's reproduction doesn't go through the small hunting tribe, but I can integrate the context of the deer if I find aspects in that context that respect the paraconsistent logic of our affinity structure. Right? But this can be everything. It can be other species, can be forests, can be the whole biomes, can be pets, whatever. It can also include non-living systems, so inorganic stuff, whose reproduction is fully conditioned by the social system. So artificial stuff that we create, like tools, like buildings, devices, they can imprint the logic of our social system. So you create a building with a huge wall. Well, in a world where the main logic is property and making sure properties are properly cut, right? And things belong to whoever owns them and are not shared, we can imprint that logic into space. That's what Lefebvre used to call abstract space, right? We can imprint it into functionality, not necessarily just into buildings and space. So instruments can also be conductive to a logic. And we can also integrate non-living systems whose reproduction is not fully or not even partially dependent on the world in question, like magma from volcanoes, the weather, the stars. Depending on which feature of these things we focus on, those features, if they respect certain aspects of the logic, they can be integrated, right? So all of this can be integrated as long as they propagate, meaning record, conduce, unpack, or unfold the logical form of the world in question, right? And my proposal is that we call nature the name of the material support of social parts in general. So we tend already to use the word nature in this way, with the exception of a philosophical use of what is physics talking about. The other main use we have to the idea of nature is the set of all these things, the material support of us ourselves as humans, of other creatures, of inorganic stuff, and of inorganic stuff that we create artificially, and inorganic stuff that is there indifferent to us, right? And my point is that we can give all of this a unity only insofar as it is integrated into the social world. So the name, rather than calling it material support, and you can ultimately see when we talk about material supports, we tend to prefer to arrive at this natural substrate, right? Only those things end up being counted. So it's not that they are here, it's that they are on the orange part here, right? So nature would be the social name for things that function like matter. But you could unbox them and then you would call them something else, like, you know, it's just under those conditions. And the fact that since not everything is in a social world, right? There are a bunch of things that it's not only that we integrate them, that we can't even think about it as part of this social horizon. Well, everything that is not part of that social horizon, which already includes inside of that horizon a lot of the material support, which then gains the name of nature, everything that is not social, right? In a certain sense, is not natural as well, but not in the sense that it's beyond nature or is not amenable to being called nature in some context. It's just that there is no unifying concept for that. It's whatever, like a particle, you know, a statistic fluctuation from the Big Bang that you can only access as a hypothesis in physics. Like, in which sense is that natural, right? It is amenable to be part of many contexts, but it's not part of a social context functioning as a material support. So I'm not 100% sure about this idea, but I do think it's nice to have like a more clear reference to what we call nature. Any way in which something which is not itself the logic of a social space, but it's being co-opted insofar as it has its own dynamic to propagate that social space. This thing here is what we usually call nature. And when we talk about naturalizing in the deprecatory way, they're naturalizing something. What we mean is you're saying that logic is just the logic of the material and not something we're imprinting on it or benefiting from it. It's just how it is, right? So the idea is that each mode of intercourse, insofar as they create boundaries, abstract cuts, or fuzzy margins between systems, conditions differently the way nature is constituted and appears in a given social space. So that's basically the idea that nature is constituted, like the set of every material support for social structures as this thing that we face as an other or not so other, or as kind of the basis of what we're doing, whatever structure that it gets. Nature is constituted through the social logic. It's not just out there inert and the social world is on this side, right? Of course, we need to also consider that the modes are combined to form more complex entities and so on. But first thing I would like to do, I know it's already a bit late, I can end on this and leave the other things for another time, is just to go over then, what does this mean for each one of the modes, right? So what is nature under mode A? And now we can explain a bit better, right? Nature now means what is the way the material support conductive to mode A, how does it appear, right? If I were to turn it into an existing thing in the world of affinity and look at the things that I'm depending on, and then I want to face them, I want to see them in front of me, constitute them as an object, as something that appears, right? How does that appear? And the wager is that it appears either as a person or as a partner. So this is a kind of well-established idea on anthropology, the idea that what we call animism, totemism, and for Marshall Sahlins, the guy I took a little bit of his text, even other forms of what is called the cosmovision or whatever, they're all pretty much the extension of a social relation that is based on affinity to any, again, living system that is not dependent on the social space, non-living system that is dependent, and non-living system that is not dependent. If you just expand from that, picking from each one of these different things, those traits that propagate the paraconsistent logic, that large lump of stuff would be called nature for affinity, and it would have the property of being a person, right? So this is just a quote from Marshall Sahlins, where he's talking about these definitions that you find in Graham Harvey and Philippe Descola, where animists are people who recognize that the world is full of persons, only some of whom are human, and life is always lived in relationships with others. Then they give another definition, I forgot from whom. Again, Descola's definition that animism is attribution of by humans to non-humans of an interiority identical to one's own. And we've been doing a lot of work recently to try to show that this structure of animism is very much just the structure of everything that you call an other still shares a common ground with you, right? It should remind you a bit of this, right? If I have the I here, the me, and this is meant to be the other, you still share a common ground or a border, which doesn't need to be like one point. It can be the majority even, right? You can have like a small bit here, which is the other, and a huge part, which is this boundary of things you share. Doesn't matter, right? It has another property, which is that it's symmetric, right? Because the boundary is on both sides. So none of the two sides can define initially who is the inside and who is the outside of that equation, right? But the basic thing I wanted to say is that it is a common anthropological idea that animism is just the expansion of this social principle of relation based on affinity to anything else, right? And what other anthropologists like Alfred Gell try to suggest is that there is an intrinsic, Marilyn Stratton does a similar thing, that there's an intrinsic connection between attributing this logic of affinity to other entities and treating them as if they are agents, meaning they're not just causally perpetuating a process. If a process happens, you can assume there is an intention of some sort, right? So this is Gell just talking about the that first, the immediate other in a relation of affinity doesn't have to be another human. The whole argument that he's making depends on the fact that this can be exercised relative to things, and social agency can be exercised by things or by other animals, and that there is something about seeing the other as a person that makes them somebody who could have agency, right? Another way of putting this, which you find like in Viveros, is the idea that they can be seen as having a perspective. I think this is my summary of it. I'm just going to quickly read it. I think it does capture a bit of what's at stake. So the core thing, I think a good way of capturing this that makes a lot of sense is just thinking about a sort of dialectic between symmetry and asymmetry in paraconsistency, right? Two systems that share a boundary are placed in symmetry since the limit between them belongs to both. So there is not one that gets the best out of it. It's like an asymmetric point of view. But this creates a disequilibrium, which is which of the systems gets to posit the value of the limit. So if I and another share something in the middle, how will we define if that middle is now attached to a third thing? Which of the two systems will get to define the determinations of the next context, so to speak? Right? The very fact that to remain within the logic of affinity, such symmetric boundaries need to be maintained explains why the logic of the gift and the counter gift is so strange. If the counter gift was equivalent to the gift, that would mean that the initial actor determined the boundary asymmetrically. I told you what type of thing you need to give me back. I give you a gift, and I give you a book, and you need to give me a book of the same value back. That means that I was the actor who decides something when you're just like causally following it. You're obliged to do it, right? So it is important for logical reasons, if we're going to treat this as a symmetric thing, that the counter gift reestablish the boundary or common ground on its own terms, meaning you now give me a gift that is not determined by my gift, so that one of us will be in debt, right? Because this brings the symmetry back. I was an actor and you are an actor. If I give you a gift and you automatically say, no, you can have it back, this is now my gift to you, this is a problem. If I give you a gift, which is a book by an author, some title, and sometime later you come and give me a book by the same author, a different edition of the same title, it again is weird, because you're treating as if you're just causally conditioned. You need to act like an actor to give me back and create an affinity bond. If I'm the actor and you act like a passive recipient who's just reacting, there is no affinity, right? So if we use Bogdanov's theory of activity and resistance as a relativity thing, every action is a reaction, right? And you can invert. If I act and something resists me, I can also invert and think of that thing acting and me resisting it somehow, right? We can also derive the corollary that Alfred Gell was exploring in that quote, that under mode A, the notion of actor of agent is invertible. Nothing guarantees initially that in an interaction between a human being and a non-human being, the former will always constitute the active side. To make affinity relations cohere with non-human creatures, I need to be able to treat what they do as agents, because this way I can combine them back to our social structure, which is based on treat the other always as an actor and not as a passive reactive thing, right? If I want to extend this and propagate this through material means, I need to find those traits in a material system that are amenable to this treatment. For example, predator-prey systems, where I don't need to treat a prey as a passive thing because it's also the predator of something else. Or in an encounter between me and another animal, it's not clear who's going to eat who. So it might sound weird, but it might also mean be more logical coherent to prefer to hunt things that could hunt you back than to hunt things that would passively just be eaten, if you need that system to play ping pong with you, so the system coheres, this larger system coheres, right? you would treat that creature, you would have logical reason to treat that creature as an actor who is engaging with you under the same principle, right? This means that nature and every consistent part of nature is constituted in mode A as, one, sharing common ground with something else, two, always being the potential source of a perspective that defines the limits of and values and of boundaries, and is either an actor or an agent, could be an actor or an agent, right? So one name we can give to this, to a substance that has these characteristics of the common ground of everything, being a potential perspective and being an agent, is something having a soul, right? And entities that possess souls are called persons. So the form of a person, if we forget what it's meant to mean, it can just be treated as the logical form either humans or non-humans need to take if you want to always be able to treat them as if every interaction creates a boundary where their reaction to your action is going to be treated as a new action, like a counter gift, in the sense that they need to be giving as well. They're not just reacting to you, right? And of course, not everything is conductive to the symmetric logic. Not everything can work in this way of creating this type of structure, but a lot of things do. Prey-predator systems, where a prey is also a predator. Sexual reproduction, where the generated also generate the next generation. Cycles of the sun, where you can treat a day being between two nights or a night being between 2 days. Mourning of the dead, because they're no longer here, but they're also here at the same time because we remind them. Logic of speech, because speech, you give something to the other, but the other needs to set the meaning because you cannot do it on your own. You share the meaning with the other. All these things are preferred material supports to affinity. And if you look at the type of thing that counts as part of the concept of nature in a lot of cosmological views of societies organized around affinity, you're going to see that the things being listed tend to be amenable to paraconsistent treatment. And the things that are not don't really appear. We can do the same for mode B. I'm going to be quicker here. And I think that there is a nice little subtlety, because a lot of literature I went into researching this doesn't separate the state treatment of nature from capital's treatment of nature, as if the process of constructing infrastructure for agriculture, hydraulical societies, management of nature, the creation of a kind of justification of domination of nature, that's the same thing that capitalists do with nature. And I think that that's wrong. I don't think that's the proper approach to it. They don't capture what's specific about nature in capitalism. So managing to discern these two things might be useful for us. So again, just going with Karatani, he starts the structure of world history when discussing mode B, again, by saying that it's interesting that most of the technologies developed by ancient civilizations had little impact directly on nature. Their main impact was actually on techniques for ruling over human beings. And then they allowed for making like large-scale irrigation agriculture possible. So bureaucracy first appears in relations between humans, and then it allows us to expand a bureaucratic relation to nature, so to speak, right? I mean, I want to go fast so we can take a break. But just so I conclude this before we discuss capital. And you can see in a lot of the good literature on this, that there is a lot that goes into the specific way of constructing nature for the state and empires, and with this idea of domination of nature. I mean, the classic European reference is possibly Linnaeus, and this idea of starting to classify the world as if there is a chain of being that has a ladder, and things are kind of all hierarchically constructed inside of that chain. But this is not a European process. And I mean, I think Rafael is not here, but he's been reading up on classic Chinese philosophy. And it's crazy how this is what they're doing most of the time. I find it very, very ironic that a lot of Deleuzian philosophers are interested in the art of, the Chinese philosopher who just goes along with the propensity of things and so on. But if you look what those guys were actually doing, they were trying to do the jurisprudence, as Caio said, of nature into the state. Like, how can I order nature? It's an art, like to pick the right differences at the right time. But the output was coming up with an ordering of what's the least to the most resourceful thing. And the core here for me is that you see nature appear as something else, which is now the notion of natural resource, right? The idea of natural resource as something that you pick to use and no longer a partner, but something that is either already cut from you, it's out there, or that you can cut from itself and bring in, like to be used as a resource, right? It's fundamentally connected to the logic of mode B. For example, if you just go to James Scott's text on seeing like a state, which is like a huge examination of what it means to anything like a resource, pretty much, and how this allows nature to be integrated, right? They no longer use the term nature, they use the term natural resources, focusing on those aspects of nature that can be appropriated for human use, right? Trees become timber, while species that compete with them become trash. Trees are underbrush. The same logic applies to fauna. Highly valued animals become game or livestock, while those animals that compete with or prey upon them become predators or variants. So this is a different kind of abstracting, right? Where it's no longer abstracting the sense we share a common boundary. It's abstracting the sense that there is a proper boundary to this thing, which is called a natural resource. It is like its own thing, and we can manage it, right? Again, just trying to summarize this. I think we could take a break here. I mean, after this, we're just trying to summarize this. I think that a good way of thinking about the logic of mode B is that there are two basic conditions on it. That we may establish a cut that separates a part from its environment, and that we may formulate consistently the property that unifies the part that we cut. So that entails an idea of ordering, which at its core organizes social groups based on stable properties and parts of larger groups as part of a common order. So the idea is that I have something like this, I want to be able to take this out, and I want to be able to tell what property that part has. Well, the moment that I do this, I'm already saying that I have a other property here and this property here, and that I can order them. This is included in this, right? So it has this double principle of cutting and true property ordering, right? This is how the question of hierarchy establishes itself, how established orders of belonging, which are either you belong or not, you need to know the exact properties that things has. It is connected to a question of measuring in a certain sense of total ordering of properties, right? And a question of situating the place of a part in a whole. So I want to be able to tell exactly how I extracted something from a whole. So chains of command depend on this logic, structure of domination depends on this logic, division between boss and functionaries. All are examples of the double process of defining the boundaries of social groups in such a way that an ordering between them takes place, takes the place of each part legible with regard, makes the place of each part legible with regards to the larger structure. And this is indifferent to the means of obtaining the separation. So as Hobbes says, like you can create a social pact out of volition or out of violence. It doesn't matter as long as the cut is established, right? So if you create this extraction through plundering, enclosures, dispossession, or by common volition, by alienating a property to the other, it doesn't matter, right? But this idea of something that has identifiable properties and that is extractable or alienatable from its surroundings, it's the idea of a resource. And again, not everything fits mode B. In fact, most things don't fit mode B, material supports, right? But some things if they have some functional closure, it's funny, there is a weird connection between the logic of life, which tries to create its own boundary and separate itself from the world, and the logic of the state. But there is a very resistant relation between the logic of inorganic reality and entropy and the state. So the state works very well with things that create clear cuts from the world, and deals very poorly with things that are in constant exchange with the world, right? So the life of that and death of creatures, on the one hand, is very good, because either you're alive or you're dead. But materially speaking, is very complicated because things die slowly. And then the state doesn't know when to pull the plug and when to consider somebody dead, right? Stages of a crop, in a certain sense, if you zoom out, you can tell periodization very well. But the detail of how you relate to the plants so that you can actually grow things is not very good for state logic. Classification of species, hierarchical dependency between living functions. So this thing depends on that thing, that depends on that thing. That's all very amenable to mode B. Pronounced physical or physiological features. So asking people about their, sexuality, organizing people by color of their skin. These things that are either you're this or you're not, it's easier for the state to organize and order, right? But the fact that materials need to be decomposed and recomposed as sets with no boundary and no margin, it also makes the logic of property to be like the most costly one, because the world is constantly disorganizing, constantly interdependent. Properties are gradients, they're not fully here nor there for most things. So you need to be constantly working against this to be able to cut the world clearly, right? So logistics, for example, is a way to making sure that these things are properly cut, right? I think, the difference between capital is crucial here, but I know it's 8 o'clock already. Perhaps we could take a break and then decide if I continue or if we just go into debate and like take this up some other time. Like take 5 or I'm not sure if what do you guys think? I know it's a lot.
I don't know what others think, but I think it would be nice if you could like take 5 minutes break and later discuss some things because it's a really interesting presentation.
Okay, no, sure. I'm okay with taking 5.
And are you okay with starting the debates later?
Sorry? Yeah, of course. Of course.
Okay.
Okay, see you guys in a minute. I forgot how long. I mean, I'm not sure how long we've been on hold. You guys tell me when we should go back.
I didn't time it either, man. I really don't know either.
Is everyone back then? It's just.
Yeah, I'm back.
Yeah.
Hey.
Yeah.
I was just telling Fernanda, I think we could kind of just stop and discuss. What I would just like to do, if you guys are okay with it, is just closing this last part. Like we went mode A, nature, mode B, and just do the mode C, and then stop there. I think like another 10 minutes and it's done. And I can leave the rest of the stuff for later. For example, a history of dogs that I created based on the modes, but we can leave that for one other day. So yeah, just to go very quickly over this, and because as I said, I think this is a real contribution to the debate that is a bit muddled right now. I mean, there are two debates going on that are interesting but a bit muddled. One is on the Marxists with ecology, which is how to move from nature to labor and Marx theory of value to the integration of nature. That's a debate that's going on. And another is the more classical canonical discussions on ecology about what did modernity do to nature? What is the modern point of view on nature? And I think that making this distinction between resource and raw material is very important to understand a crucial division between capitalist societies and a treatment of nature as a resource, which is a much older thing that most societies that have strong states, that had agricultural systems, that change nature in this way, they already spoke about dominating nature. And they already thought of nature as something that you need to know, like an artful way of cutting nature into parts and so on. So that there's some difference there. So what is that difference, right? So I'm not even going to read the quotes, just going to summarize what they are about. You can read them later. But what Kohei Saito does very nicely in his book on Marx, Eco-Socialism, is to make this point here. Again, it resonates very nicely with Karatani, that the same principle of division of labor, cooperation, and machinery that applies to humans, it's also applied to nature. So what is that principle? If you open Capital in the chapters on cooperation, manufacture, and so on, what you see is that the way humans are treated in the production process by capital is that there is no predetermined way in which you will be decomposed. So if you do a complete action of taking something, putting in front of you, nailing it with a hammer, and then painting it, and then passing along, or if you're just going to pick it up, change its position, give for somebody else to nail, and then for somebody else to paint, nothing determines this beforehand. What determines what actions you're going to do is the overall preservation of value and increase of value in the production process. So what properties you will present in the production process are determined by the overall circuit of value and not the inverse. You will adapt. And it's no wonder, I mean, we've discussed this often, how the Soviets were impressed that, artists who are choreographers who are trying to discover new gestures for art and dance, they went into factories and they saw how workers were working, and they realized they were making totally nonsensical gestures, because nobody would spend their whole day picking up a piece of iron and putting it there and just perfecting this gesture to make it the most efficient thing. It has no purpose for your survival. It has no meaning as a human action that achieves any outcome. It only makes sense in the context of that production process. So decomposing things as if they don't have inner properties that you need to respect. So you decompose them in whatever way you want, as long as you can recompose them and preserve value. That's different than decomposing objects to preserve their properties. That's a resource. A resource is looking at nature to preserve properties, so you can exploit properties that are internal to the material support. Capital doesn't look at nature as if it has inherent properties. It looks at nature as if you can cut it into pieces, turn it into whatever you need so that value comes on the other side. So the properties that are meaningful come from the outside. They don't come from the inside, right? And you can see this I don't want to go into this, but Andreas Malm's text on fossil capital and why fuel rather than other forms of power. Like, why did we focus capitalism on finding fuel and finding this really plastic, almost propertyless properties, right, as the basis for running the economy, rather than finding the resources that had the best properties? Because there was a moment in industrialization where there was a possibility that we would create in England a bunch of water ducts and use water as the main source of power rather than steam and later fossil fuel. And it was aborted, even though it was more efficient. And if you look at how he explains this, he doesn't put it in these terms, but you can see that part of the problem is that water has an internal property we wanted. Water is not something we could turn into whatever property we want in terms of qualities, right? So resources and raw material, they have this distinction. Resources have inherent qualities that we separate. And raw material doesn't have inherent qualities, right? The qualities that are useful or valuable depend on the value of commodities. If it's more valuable to use timber as wood, we will. If it's more valuable to use timber as coal, just burn the trees and use them as fuel, we will. So you don't know how you look at a forest before you know what circuit of valorization is the most efficient. If there is more value in treating trees as the source of oil for shampoo, that's what we're going to be looking at. If there's more value in treating trees as the source of really valuable wood that we can make furniture, that's how we're going to be looking at. That's not how the state looks at trees. The state looks at trees as having some qualities, some properties that you want to manage, right? So, for example, you get this very ridiculous looking Mark Perry, senior fellow of American Entrepreneurial Institute or whatever, saying, guys, there is no natural resources, only raw materials. So don't take it from me, take it from Mark Perry. And you find, for example, links on their website to things like this. What is the chemical composition of Earth, Venus, or Mercury? Like, are there things we could extract from these planets, right? Chemical composition is not the inherent property of any particular thing. It's below that surface, right? It's like the subatomic level, right? It's the level of the things before objects have particular properties. So if, for example, just think of this, like the idea that you can take waste and turn it into a valuable commodity because you can take the carbon, take the aluminum, take this and that, and then sell those things. What are you selling? You're not selling anything that has a particular quality in the sense of a resource, like a tree that has some functional thing intrinsic to it. You're selling a thing searching for a function, right? That's what a raw material is. So just to conclude, and why this is different, and this is much more amenable to the logic of value, you can think of value as having this open structure. We said it has a margin, right? Which means that socially existing entities for value have margins rather than cuts or boundaries. They can be understood by realizing that mode C functions via a logic of destruction and construction. Any part that can be destroyed, meaning losing its form, but remaining materially relevant to value, and then reemployed in a constructive process, so taken to acquire a new function as part of a stepwise procedure, build on the available material, can be evaluated by capital. So whatever is there, if I can remove its form and give it a new form through labor, I can potentially put it back into the world of value, right? It's an open logic in two senses. First, it is constructively open. which is kind of technical sense, because we only deem to exist what we can explicitly construct. If this is the case, the difference between what we can construct as being part of a production process and what we can construct as not being part of it, we can prove it's not part of it, leaves a margin open. This is a technical point about intuitionism. You can, just because I proved something to be correct or true, doesn't mean, and I proved something to be false, doesn't mean I covered the whole space. There is a margin left. To redo work procedures such that labor might be more intense, more efficient, optimizing time and value is a way to explore the useful margins of commodity. So if I can decompose something and reconstruct it in one way, and then I can find another way to reconstruct it that takes advantage of it even better, I can just explore it in this way in many ways, right? The second is that it is destructively open, in that a given commodity can be broken into previously inaccessible parts. So you can shatter its form, finding new lower scale properties that might allow for new types of construction. So rather than only using wood to do things that I know wood have the quality to do, I can break trees into smaller bits, weirder chemical components, and then do something that nobody thought has something to do with trees. Like I look at my shampoo these days, it tells me that it has like the weirdest cotton. Like, what does cotton have to do with shampoo? How do you put cotton in your shampoo? Like, you need to clearly do some weird chemical process, right? It's not cotton as a raw material, like as a resource. It's cotton as raw material, right? And I think that it's nice to see that the difference between technology and techniques has a lot to do with this. Technique is a constructive procedure that combines forms that are already available. Technology implies the introduction of previously unavailable aspects of the material support in the production of an active effect. This is like a Simondon definition of the difference, when he says that technology involves exploring a lower scale property on an upper scale process, like steam, right? You're exploring the fact that you can create pressure by exciting molecules of water. That's not a quality that water has as a resource, right? So a name for a substrate that has no definitive properties, it's open to decomposition, and determines the available means of a procedure, so you need to recompose using only those things, is a raw material, right? And the crazy thing is that, and we can explain why capitalism is so kind of connected to the material world more than mode A or mode B, because it resonates very well with physical reality, which is filled with structures that draw macro properties from lower level interactions, flows of energy, prevents the formation of closed systems with entropy and so on, right? So the fact that we can store and again record, capture, propagate traits that have an intuitionistic logic very easily on a material support is kind of a weird, tragic aspect that makes capitalism very scalable, because very easy to print something amenable to capitalist logic on physical reality, right? Yeah, so yeah, I just wanted to get through this third thing so we can compare the three of them. And I know it's probably not enough time to go in deep into all of this stuff. I can see it, most people are already left or are asleep, but yeah. I mean, this is what the basic I wanted to cover today. Like the rest that I had in this slide, there are more examples and some stuff that I'm going to cover later on anyway. Did it make any sense, Guy?
Yeah, I think it was great. I think it really gives us something to test our system against that we've been developing right now. And now we can really put it up against nature and see what works and what doesn't. I feel like this last point about resource versus raw material is not exactly clear to me, because, well, at least for mode B dominated societies, like there was still manipulation of nature, right? That you said, like, domination of nature it's still part of ancient, more ancient forms of society, pre-capitalist. So what kind of is that still raw material? Like, there's still a mixture of raw material and resource happening in these older societies, right?
Yeah, this is why. Yeah, I think that this is the crucial thing. The only good example I could find, I didn't have time to go into it, and I only thought of it yesterday. I spent like a whole day researching this, and I was very happy to see that it is confirmed. Is the history of dog breeding, because I can't think of a better example of the difference between trying to make more pronounced through breeding traits that are already in a living creature versus not really giving a shit about its form and just doing whatever is useful to others, has value for others, then the creation of a pug. Like, these dogs that they have difficulty to breathe, like they're proof that we change something through a breeding process that just makes them almost like unlivable, like these huge dogs, I forgot the name, dog alemão, I don't know how to call it in English, that they have like hip dysplasia, like, and there is a history of this. Like, if you look at you can go to mode A dog, like people today, they show that we were wrong about how dogs appeared out of wolves. There was actually a process of affinity between wolf societies and human societies. They co-evolved in a way for a long time. Then with the formation of huge states, like in Saudi Arabia 8,000 years ago, in China 6,000 years ago, in Pompeii 4,000 years ago, you started finding pictures of dogs with collars or paintings or figures where they are associated to a function, which is guarding a space. And then you start seeing, for example, around 1400s, treatises, both in China and in Britain, about how to classify dogs. And they're classified by the function that they have. Lap dogs, hunting dogs, things like this. And then you breed them to make it more pronounced, more salient, the property you think is essential to that group. And then in the 1800s, there was something called the Victorian explosion, which is not only aristocrats, but mostly British aristocrats started breeding dogs just to see what types of dog would appear. And out of all the dog races we have today, the dog breeds we have today, I think 80% are from that time. And it's when people started breeding dogs, no longer to let's say, accentuate an intrinsic quality to that line of dogs, but to create dogs for whatever people wanted, out of fancy. Let's see what happens if I just try to create the smallest dog possible, right? The smallest dog possible is not a feature of dogs, it's a feature of the use value for others of the dog. So you see the creature like deforming and becoming this weird rat, unbreedable thing by a process of selection that is driven by use value for others versus the process of breeding that is guided by accentuating something that is supposed to be already in the dog, like the essence of the dog. Let's make the most German Shepherd of German Shepherds, right? Something like this. Do you see the difference there? Like, for me, it was clarifying.
It's like the difference between. I was wondering, well, how are you going to bring dogs into it? But now it makes sense. Yeah, it's like the difference between cultivation versus like manipulation.
Yeah, something like this. For the sake of showing you my beautiful slide.
Amazing.
Yes, I'm really happy. And this is a treatise. This is how they classified the English doggies, the diversity, the names in around 1500. And this guy classifies them. There are only 16 varieties, right? Terrain, Harriet, Bloodhound, Gazehound, blah, blah, blah. Only based on their functions. Caio's classification was based on function rather than physical appearance. And then you have the Victorian explosion in 850, which says that that's where modern dogs were invented. And then they only had one term, breed, so they become the same thing. They're material for trying to reproduce them whatever way, right? Dog breeds were something entirely new, defined by their form, not their function. So yeah, I say that like cultivation is a negotiation, is still, I mean, this is the weird thing, because domestication of dogs or wolves to turn to dogs has something to do with cultivation in the sense of you negotiate, right? But you negotiate in a symmetric way. Then with the state, there is cultivation in the more strong sense, which implies a domination, right? But it implies domination and a manipulation, but in the sense that there's still negotiation, because you do want to kind of cut reality or cut nature at the joints in such a way that you preserve essences, right? The form is the functional thing of it is inside of it, right? And then you don't do that with raw material. I'm not sure if that helps. Like for me, it was clarifying looking at a pincher.
Yeah, thanks for that. It does help. I think we have to tie it back to this logical thing of like margins versus cuts. Like the margin of a dog would be something like, yeah, what is neither covered in dog and not dog, right? It's neither of the two. It's like some properties that reside in this liminal space of dogness. And that's what causes the Victorian explosion. The fact that you can take like smallness, the size of the nose or whatever, like they're neither characteristic of dogs, nor are they outside of the dog category, right? They're somewhere in between. So yeah, something like that is.
Yeah, I think that the way that I think of this is like this. I mean, again, I'm not sure, but I think might be useful. Is think of mode B as ordering in cutting and ordering. So you don't really construct, you cut and you order. So if something is to have a function, it must already have that function somehow, right? It must be there. So, and then you order the importance, you separate the functions, but no wonder it needs to dominate and not kill, because if you want to have subservience, you need to keep them there in a function of subservience, right? Whereas capital and value, it's not a matter of cutting and ordering, it's a matter of destroying and constructing. So destroying in the sense that you don't care for the forms that things already had. You want to know the forms they will have once you've constructed something, right? It's because of the centrality of construction that you get margins. Because perhaps I'm going too far here, but constructive formal systems, they are intuitionistic, right? They can only prove what you explicitly construct. You cannot, the complement of a constructive proof is not a proof of the negation, right? So right. I would say the margin is just, let's say, the fact that it leaves things open, and the form is always provisory as an output, right? It's never preserved because of where you started. But I think that I mean, it's not clear for me 100%, but I do think that it's a deep enough insight about how these two things are separate, like, and of course they go along together, but it's very different, for example, to dominate nature and order and give kind of centrality to things that are already functional in nature, natural systems, which is a way of, let's say, enclosing land, enclosing forests that is mode B centric. and the way capitalists use property structures, where they're not enclosing forest, they're enclosing raw material. So it's property at the service of raw material. So when you have a debate between the state trying to preserve a forest from depredation and capitalists trying to use the forest, they don't see the contradiction, because it's not a matter of preserve or not preserve. They're all for those functions. They're just asking, what if you could get those functions while also making money, right? I mean, what if we could separate form and function and get mechanical lungs for the planet, and we can burn this and make coal and make, you know, whatever. So there is a perspective dissonance, right? It's not like modern constitution. It makes the state and capital look at nature in the same way. Nature is constituted differently. That's also why inside the production process, properties are a bit removed. Like, you don't care so much about property. You do care about undoing and redoing things in the most effective, constructive way possible, right? But yeah, I think it's kind of there. It's not there yet.
Kai, you had a question? Did you ask your question? Sorry.
It was more to check on an example, actually, because this distinction for the dog, it makes sense because it's potentially there for both. I was wondering how one could apply this, for example, for like a bioengineering or biotechnology in terms of plantation. You know, like, we're trying like the technology that's being used to make it possible for there to be like a certain crop in a place where it wouldn't naturally be able to be planted. That would fall precisely in the term of bringing out something that is already there, in the sense that, okay, we want what is already there, we just want it in a different place. Or no, this would be defying things and artificializing them for that matter, and then it would be within value, as you said.
Yeah, I think that a good answer to this, I mean, I don't want to make this into, again, I think we do this with the mode sometimes, like, which mode is this in? And of course, that in reality is everything mixed, right? And you just want to have good tools to see what is relevant and where. And I think that it can be very mixed up. But I think that it is, the core idea is actually in Andreas Malm's quote. When he says this, he says, the capitalist cares not for the material qualities of his good. And then he quotes, he does not manufacture boots for their own sake, nor cutlery to put on his own table, blah, blah, blah. But he cannot sell the idea of boots or cutlery or houses. For his goods to attract demand, they must be such articles endowed with a minimal use value, allowing for walk on uneven terrain, scooping up food, or shielding against cold and rain. So to earn this process, industrial capitalists must take a detour through nature, right? Setting up some version of the metabolic interaction within its precincts. I think that the whole point is, if you ask why a capitalist would want to put a crop in a place that it doesn't exist, the answer has nothing to do with that crop as a crop. It has something to do with a larger process that is going to be more cost beneficial to plant them in this place rather than that place, right? So if it's dysfunctional in that place to have a crop or some plant, but you can change the plant to make it be there because it's more cost efficient. Like, if you were to understand what they're looking at, you probably have to think about this thing, which is not function preserving, right? And if tomorrow it's cheaper to sell those crops as hay for cattle, they will do. They do this all the time, right? You do create this huge plantation. You say, okay, they care for the plantation, and then tomorrow the price changes, and they say, okay, this is now all hay. What is it to look at a plantation and say, this is no longer a plantation, this is hay in the middle of a process, and I'm going to carry on this other process and sell it? right? This is the fact that it's always raw material at any moment of the process, right? So it's not raw material in the sense of wild, untamed, pure something. It's just a thing that is waiting for a form, right? Something like that. Fala, German.
Thank you, makes sense.
Is it, and about this topic, and it's it seems a description that is made by the point of view of intuitionist logic, in the sense that we don't have a net boundary between when a thing has a form, a proper form, and the moment it turns in a raw material. It seems to me that we can say something like that. I don't know if I'm clear in what I'm talking about, but I would like to go to another topic if it's possible. I don't know.
Sure.
Do we have time?
Yeah.
Okay. And well, I would like to ask if you see a difference of scales between not only between organism and the ecosystems and the social world, but between the ecosystem and the social world, because between organism and the other two, it's a little bit clear, but the relationship between ecosystem, I don't know if you use this word, but you understand what I don't remember the word you use.
Yeah, no, it's the same.
It's the same, okay. And this social world, the relationship between these two is a scalar one? It's of scales, different scales, or not, or it's another relationship. And there is two other questions, but I don't know if you would like to.
No, if you want to ask them all, then I can try to address them.
Okay. And I think I don't get very well the difference of the relation between the living creatures in an ecosystem and in a social world, because in both we have the relations between the living creatures, but it seems, I don't know if it's correct, this comprehension, that in the case of the social world, we have a mediation with the whole of the world in question there, but I don't know, is my internet connection is unstable. I don't know if you.
No, I understood the question, but it is a bit. It was cortou pouquinho no final. Mas tô te ouvindo.
Okay. And the third one is about Plato. I tell you later.
Just mention it. Can't you just say it?
So this difference you made between what's important for use a social atom, or that thing with the orange structure. What's the name you gave that?
The material.
The material. Yes. So that structure, remember me the feel when Socrates says that for given account to go away or stay, and he said that some philosophers said that it's important that he has bones or flesh or that kind of thing, and he says, so this is important to do that, but it's not the cause that makes difference for this situation. Remember me this part of Fido, and I don't know if
No, it may, yeah. Okay, I'll try to talk about the three things, especially because the last slide is a quote from Plato. So
thank you.
Fefe, do you want to? I think. Sorry.
Very, very interesting.
Germana, acho que agora você está cortando um pouco. Não sei se alguém conseguiu ouvir.
Não, também não.
Fefe, do you want to ask your question? Just so now I can. Now I can hear you. I wrote down the questions here. Fefe, could you ask yours as well, so we can talk about all of it?
Okay. Yes. I'm going to ask in the chat because I'm like really like I have a flu and my voice is like
Sure. Okay.
I put the quotes that
Mhm.
referring to.
So when you say nature is the name we give to the material support of social parts, and though not everything is nature, since not everything is in a social world, the fact that there is no one concept, the fact here is no one concept for what is social also means there is no one concept for what is not natural. And then you say, so if we don't have a concept for what is not natural, and nature isn't everything, why nature isn't everything if there is not something not natural? Yeah, it's a really good, difficult question. For example, there are things that people will put on the supernatural, which are not social, not natural things. Or it can be ways of trying to integrate things that you don't have a natural concept for them. But I think that I'll try to answer this also, just add it here as the questions. Why isn't nature everything? So just to go part by part, right, with the questions. The issue of scale, I think that the best way to think about these things is to invert them a bit. Like, why aren't there huge animals, right? Why aren't there animals the size of planets? And people who study this, Galileo used to study this, and then there's a really good book by a guy called Geoffrey West called Scale, which has a really good long discussion about this, which is that there is a scalar limit, or what they call a scalar threshold, to how costly it is to integrate organs of a big creature, right? If you have a very, very, very big creature, if you want all the parts to be alive and the whole to be alive, which means some things, right? Okay, this is a huge question by Morris. Okay, I'll try to address it as well. But there is a scalar limit to creating a living creature. It's called allometry, the field that studies this type of scalar limits, because, for example, you need to pump blood through larger and larger distances, and therefore you need a larger heart. And a really beautiful thing, I always felt like it was a amazing thing. Do you guys know that mammals, even like you can have very small mammals like a rat and a huge mammal like a whale, they tend to have the same amount of heartbeats in their life. Small rat, their heart beats a lot, fast, very fast, and they live very short lives. Whales live very long lives, but their hearts beat very slow. Their metabolism is very slow. If you plot that in a line, you see a straight line between heartbeats and the length of a life of a mammal, because on the whole they tend to have the same amount of heartbeats. It's a kind of scalar constant. So if you need to create a huge creature that will have to pump their hearts faster to be able to put the blood to circulation into these larger distances, it will be costly. It will make it harder for them to be in an environment where they can do that and so on. So I would put scale not as a dimension of the logic or of the categories we're talking about, but as consequences that you can find when they play out. So we can even talk about this in terms of, if you call, let's say, why not, the function of an organ, a context, right? A logical context. Some things make a difference to the organ and some things don't. To bind organs together in a way that the big thing with all the organs is itself alive, which means that it also is a living context with regards to other things, there will be some limitations, right? The difference between living organisms, ecosystems, and social systems does have a scalar consequence. It's much easier to scale up a social system than an ecosystem, because an ecosystem, it needs to share the environment. Creatures in an ecosystem, they interact not necessarily directly, right? They interact with each other, but they also interact with the same environment. So some bacteria keeps the water with oxygen, and then the fish can breathe in that water. Or they keep the ammonia level at some level that creates plankton that then the whale eats. So the output of the living systems into an ecosystem is already a way of using the material support to propagate life. But it's an external relation, right? Of course, you're changing the environment and the environment is changing you. Then all those creatures mediate their relation via the environment more than via themselves. This already allows the whole to be much bigger, because the ecosystem can be both alive, have living aspects, inorganic aspects, and so on. But it's integrated, right, into them. Social systems are already more like that. You're already trying to create such a plastic thing that even environments that are not connected could form a social system, like in a sci-fi thing where you have planets. You can have a social system amongst planets, but you couldn't have an ecosystem amongst planets, right? The cost of connecting the planets so that they are sharing resource through the medium, it's very expensive, right? So physics, there's a moment where physics can put a limit, a scalar threshold on ecosystems as well. This leads to the second question, which is what's the difference between a living creature in an ecosystem and a living creature in a social system? And for me, the division of labor is still the best example, simply because function is now correlated. It doesn't need to be the whole in the sense of totality, in the sense of a complete global thing, but it's just something, just a divergence between the criteria of how you assign functions and the criteria of what guarantees life, right? So to move away from humans, let's go to ants. Ants have some type of division of labor because they divide between soldier ants and, you know, other type of ants. That division is not guaranteeing the survival of an ant, right? It's not guaranteeing, to be a soldier is not something that makes the ant eat food. To be a soldier is something that guarantees the ant colony's distribution of tasks, and then that distribution of tasks indirectly guarantees the survival of the ant, right? Even the killing of ants can guarantee the survival of ants. So you can integrate death into that even, right? So that divergence between function and survival function, that's something that separates ecosystems from social systems. Like, of course, animals can become differentiated, functionally differentiated through evolution because they are co-evolving with other creatures. But if you look at what they are doing, if you look at the species or an individual, they're still managing to eat alone. Like, they're doing something that brings them food to the table. Only in social systems you can look at a person and nothing they do has anything to do with eating, right? And still they eat. So that type of system, which is a weird kind of, you could even probably, I've read about this, like if you take the early stage of generation of new creatures, where, for example, mother birds will feed their young birds, right? That's almost social moment in an ecosystem. If you just generalize that moment, it looks more social than then what they want to do, they want to erase that moment as quick as possible so that the bird becomes autonomous, and then they eat alone, even if indirectly their own survival is talking to the survival of other animals, right? But survival and activity doesn't diverge. In social systems, survival and activity diverge. Ultimately, it's why the difference between survival and living is a social difference, right? Only in social systems can you survive but not live. It's Marx's thesis, right? As for Plato, I think that I mean, a lot of this is developed out of Badiou, so it makes perfect sense that it would fit with Plato. I think that the insight is good. I'm just not going. We can talk about it later on WhatsApp, just so we don't take too much time, and I can talk about Fernanda and Mauriz's question really quick here. I think that it's a counterintuitive idea to say, let's restrict nature to have a meaning, which is the material support of social systems, even if we're talking about material things we're not directly relating, like the stars, right? Andromeda is not helping us survive, but we do look at Andromeda, if you want to look at it socially, insofar as it's constituted as nature in a social formation. You look at it from within a moment in history, and then you see it as, you know, a part of the universe where matter comes from. That's the way we started looking at it when we started studying the composition of stars, 1700s, right? You can look at stars as helping organize and classify planets, and the whole discussion about astronomy for like 1,000 years in China, but also in Italy and places, was what is in the center, like as an ordering problem, right? You're not worried about the composition of the sun. You're worried about what is at the center, who is at the order of what, right? Or you can look at the stars and see that ancestor, something that is looking back at you with something that has something to do with like stars, animals, drawings, figures, personifying them. So astrology, solar system, and chemical composition of stars are three ways of looking at the stars. All of them are looking at nature, right? So the question is, what does it mean to say that there is no concept of what is not social, and therefore there's also not concept of what is not natural? It just means that we need to do things to integrate them into our world, right? So it's not like a profound metaphysical idea. There are things that are not nature. There are things that are not social, because everything we try to show today is that, in effect, even nature is social, and nature will appear to us through these modes, and that's how it gets constituted for us. So in effect, the idea of something which is appearing to us totally unmediated and is just out there, it doesn't exist, right? Like you can do this, and then this leads to Mauriz's question. You can do this through physics, right? Physics does study something regardless of us, regardless of how it integrates with us. It doesn't care. Like, it actually needs not to care, right? But in that sense, physics is not studying anything natural. It's not even an important idea, right? The only thing physics needs from nature is the idea that whatever it is looking at has some regularity, but it cannot adapt those things to us. It needs to adapt us to those things. That's why it doesn't use natural language to describe particles based on our ideas. It tries to adapt our ideas to fit how particles behave. right? So there are a lot of things which are not natural. And this is the weird thing. Why is physics not describing nature? And it isn't. It's a weird thing. It's describing physical reality. They don't say, guys, we just found out that there is a particle in nature. That's why physics has something to do with a slightly different realm, right? But at the same time, I think just looking at Morris' question about mathematical science, there seems to be something common between this increasing precision of instruments, the idea of inherently mathematical nature, the epistemological process of science, which corresponds somehow to mode C. Also, when one looks at the way how logic can be subverted, we can do that. You can't do that with science. There's something like a mode B level to natural science, but it gets supported by increasing precision of instruments, purification of elements. I'm of the position that science is asocial. I don't think science has a commitment to any of these logics, which is something which is weird because we're used to think that logic and mathematics are the same thing. But mathematics is not logics. Mathematics can do things that logics cannot do. Logics are being obliged to be very logical, doesn't make for good mathematics. Mathematicians, physicians, they're very practical, pragmatic. I do think that there is a connection between development of natural science and capitalism, because it is a social space that is less respectful of intrinsic qualities of these material supports, right? The idea that you can fuck around and find out, so to speak, because you're not obliged to respect any resource, right? Or any partnership. In a sense, you could see people funding science because of that. But at the same time, it's not true that capitalism funds the best science. I think that there is a big misunderstanding about the progress of science. Science has progressed a lot because science is learning a lot, but it's being stalled by capitalism because capitalism doesn't fund the best science. Like even in particle physics, like string theory is overfunded like crazy compared with other models of physics we have today that are more promising. And it's being more funded because it has a lot of other political and technological side products. So it's very hard to fund fundamental research in physics if you cannot tell the technological output that it will have. And technology, I think, is very much connected to capitalism. But I think technology and science are not the same. And I think mathematics, mathematized science is, to be honest, physics today, pretty much, if you take some of the most crazy recent ideas in physics, which claims that there are intransitive relations, like the physical laws at the macro level are different from the physical laws at the micro level, and they don't converge, meaning you don't get the macro just by going upwards. If that's true, there is no nature for physics, because you have physical laws that don't align in their description of the universe and will never align. So the world described by quantum physics, the world described by relativity, they will never be the same world. If that's true, physics is not describing the natural world. It's not describing one world, right? So it doesn't have that commitment. It's not worried about that. It's describing the world of science, and that's only its commitment. So I think that there is something there that could also be unpacked, though I totally see, of course, that there are a lot of connections, especially with mode B and mode C and the development of science. But I think that even in that sense, Bruno Latour and those guys from like how it's called, social studies of science, right? They do good in showing that there is a lot of mode A in science, and scientists are also negotiating with their materials in ways that are not just, let me see what is the property of this function and ordering reality, nor just, decomposing things and making nature disappear behind mathematics. It's a lot of stuff. So I think that what would be the social science, the sociology of science from our perspective, from all of this, I think it would separate a bit science from technology as well. And there's something asocial about this pursuit of what is invariable in natural phenomena, in the matter behind natural phenomena, that leads us away from nature into something else, which is physics, right? It doesn't correspond. Like, this is weird. Like, if physics was describing the natural world, the more it talks about nature, the more we would feel like, okay, now I see it. Yes, nature. The more physics talks about nature, the less sense it makes. It has absolutely no commitment to making sense. And I think that capitalism has a commitment to making value sense, right? It wants to invest in science that makes monetary sense. I'm not sure if that answers, Maurice, what you were asking, but
I mean, I very much agree with what you said, like that there's this divergence between nature and physical reality. But to my point of view, it seems like it is nature as like a certain idea of nature as we see it, as humans, as bodily beings, as phenomenal beings, versus a different nature, which is seen from a different perspective. And I was wondering, like, if this different perspective, which is not ours as like material beings being involved in nature itself, might have something to do with like a specific perspective from a social standpoint, which might be like, like a historical point of view, which is not human.
yeah, like how I think we can separate it. So because I think I totally agree with you. I think that I would have three levels. There is a level of what's amenable to our form. So you could define nature with regards to humans. I don't think that's what we're trying today, because this social concept is very, very broad, right? And it's much broader, and it's so broad that it can totally contradict our understanding of it. It can make for an equal inhumane picture. So like if you go into, a factory where they are feeding goose to make foie gras, you're going to see something that makes no sense. Like, you're not going to see something that makes sense. It's going to be like a totally monstrous nature, because it's nature seen from the standpoint of the technology that most easily extracts the foie gras from the goose, even by deforming the animal completely. It has nothing to do with a scientific experiment. And I think that's part of what a certain tradition of criticizing science has done. It says, like, science twists and turns nature because it wants answers to weird questions. We twist and turn dogs, as I was saying, like to create a pincher or to extract foie gras in the best quality, the easiest, most efficiently from geese, right? Those are not processes that are not guided by the same principle at all, right? They share the fact that they will produce inhuman pictures, and perhaps because of that, we will then say that they're similar. And it might even be the case that you employ some science in order to do that to the animals, but it just looks on the surface like they are experiments in the sense that you're messing around with material to produce something that it wouldn't produce automatically, spontaneously, right? But the processes themselves are totally different. And I think that difference is very, very important, because one is distorting because it is social. The other is distorting because it doesn't care about social structure, right? Like if you ask a scientist, why the hell are you going to the north of Brazil to measure if a star is deformed when it goes behind the sun in an eclipse like Eddington did? The explanation to that has absolutely no social justification, right? But if you ask, why are you planting the crops in a place that is not meant to have those crops? Or why are you doing this to these geese? The explanation is social. right? So that there is a difference there that is very profound. And I mean, I don't think that I imagine that one reading of what I said today could be, well, therefore, the outer world only exists for us. And that's not what I'm saying, because the geese that are being tortured pretty much don't exist for us. It's not like they're, oh, nature only exists if I give it a meaning. It has no meaning, but you're doing it for social reasons. That's slightly different, right? And I'm just saying that when you don't treat what we call nature with that social kind of lens, you simply don't call it nature regularly. Artists call it material. They don't think like I'm putting nature in my canvas, right? Material, like, which is a weird thing. It's a weird relation you keep with the material. It's not a social relation. Or when you're experimenting to find out what are the chemical properties of paint, you're not doing anything social, right? So there are, of course, there are stuff out there, but for some reason, what we call nature tends to be material with some social relation. That's what I was trying to, but I'm not sure if that came across.
Gotta think about it, but thank you.
I think it would be really nice if we can discuss more of this and go back to this presentation.
Yeah, I mean, I at some point I hope to do like, I can do a point 2 rather than just go to the next thing. So whenever we have free time, I can add it to the calendar. Guys, thank you so much. I know it's very late for a lot of people, and thank you all for sticking to the end.
No, it was awesome. Thank you very much.
Thank
It was
you,
awesome.
guys.
Thank you.
Beijocas. Bye-bye.
Até mais, gente. Falou.
Até mais.